We must continue, though. We got to get to our next topic, guys. TKO Group Holdings and the plaintiffs from Lee versus Zuffa have appeared to reach another deal. This time worth $375 million, up from the $335 million earlier this year, which was deemed not enough by Judge Peter Boulware. To be clear, the first deal was for both Lee versus Zuffa and Johnson versus Zuffa. And again, this current deal is only for the former, Lee versus Zuffa. Here to help us unpack all this is John Nash, who has a podcast and newsletter called Hey, Not the Face. He's covered these types of stories for a long time in our sport. I'm a fan, and he does an excellent job. Welcome, John, and please start off by sharing your reaction to this new deal that's, again, not official, but it's now out there, $375 million for the Lee versus Zuffa.
Well, I mean, you can't get too excited either way because the judge has to approve it. And the judge made it clear he is not going to, he's not going to delay the trial that's set for February unless he approves this. So I just wait and see. There's, everybody got a little ahead of themselves. I think last settlement, thinking it was all over. The judge made it clear that that's not the case. So I am going to wait and see what he has to say. But it's definitely an improvement. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been improved over the previous settlement from the fighter's point of view, but I'm still not certain it's enough to, satisfy the judge's demands.
Could the judge have guided them by saying, at least this is what I'm looking for? Or is that unethical? I mean, I don't know, because when you say I don't think it's enough, it sounds like you have a number in mind of what is.
Well, I mean, it might be enough for this judge. I just don't know. He did say last they had a hearing, and he commented that what he would like to see, or not that we'd like to see, that he pointed out that he granted class certification for a case that was asking from $811 million to $1.6 billion. And if they won in trial, trebling it, the settlement for Lee at the time would have been about 10% what they potentially could have won on treble damages. So that implies that, he thinks it should be a much higher amount. But he could approve this. We don't know. He might look at this because his other big problem was that Johnson and Lee were put together as one case, which they have conflicts of interest. Lee is the older case, fighters from 2010 to 2017. They're basically, all the fighters in that group are done fighting. What they're looking for is monetary compensation. Johnson is 2017 on. They're looking for two things. One is monetary compensation, but also some form of injunctive relief that would change the business model of the UFC so there'd be more competition going forward, that they have more opportunity. So they split that. That's good news for, what the judge wanted to see. But the question is the monetary amount. Is this going to be enough to satisfy what he indicated? Now, he can come out and say the high-tech Silicon Valley case, the judge basically, when they had a settlement, he said it wasn't enough, and I think you should add 60 million to that to get my approval. He could very well say that. And the good news is, in some ways, maybe this is not the settlement the judge wants to see. But the two litigant parties might have thought, let's put forward the settlement now, several months before the trial, because if he doesn't agree to it, he can indicate what he finds wrong with it, and then maybe we can work out a deal before the trial. So there's that possibility, too, that they just wanted to get some sort of settlement, a new offer on the table, as close as they can get between the two parties, just to see what the judge's reaction to it is.
Did I get that right? Where at the beginning of the $335 million, it was both cases, and they say it goes from 335 to 375, but it feels like there's a $75 million lift, because I think between the two cases, most of the money was going to the first one, right? Lee versus Zuffa. Of the $335 million, was there an exact number of what was going their way? I heard 80%.
The split originally the split was 70-30 for Lee Zuffa. Then they adjusted it to make the judge happy, 90-10. So Lee would have got $193 million. The rest would have gone to the Johnson class. But this settlement, which is 90% of, if you take the 40 million increase and then 90% of the original 335, that comes out to 73.5 million more for the Lee class, which is, I mean, I know a lot. You look at the 811 to 1.6 billion that they're asking for. It's still a small fraction of that, but for the fighters in the class, there are, many of them that probably look at that like a sizable amount of money right now.
Were you surprised at how all this has played out at the speed that it's going? because like you said, they were asking for a lot more early on, but again, that was a long time ago.
Well, they were asking a lot more in the trial, not in the settlement. You always negotiate down. The thing people got to be aware of when you go into very few antitrust cases and class action cases go, especially class action cases, go to trial because the risk is so dangerous for both parties. For the UFC, they do not want to go to trial because the damages they have to pay will be trebled. They really didn't want to go to trial when injunctive relief was on the table. That's the triple damages, and the fact that their business model could be changed was, which would just destroy the business that they have if they lose. That's something they didn't want to face. They want to settle. From the fighter's point of view, remember, this is a federal trial. They have to get all 8 jurors to agree with them to win. If 1 or 2 jurors sit out, they don't win the trial. They have a split jury, and they'd have to go back and retrial. So they technically lose because they don't win. And on top of that, they've spent 10 years on this case. The attorneys do not get paid. They only get paid if the fighters win. The attorneys are paying for this case. So the attorneys, the law firms sponsoring the fighters, they've spent tens of millions of dollars on legal experts, travel, hotels, data code entry for all the documents. They have over 1 million UFC documents they had to go through, and plus tens of thousands, well over 100,000 hours of work, unbilled work they have right now. And so from their point of view, it's like the risk for them is we could go to trial and end up with nothing except a huge debt we've incurred. So both sides have tremendous risk. They want to settle. The way you settle is who has the most leverage going into negotiations. Losing injunctive relief took a lot of leverage away from the fighters in Lee. But if you're a person upset that there's no potential contract change, the good news for the fighters is, yes, they don't have injunctive relief for Lee, but because Johnson's been split off and no longer settled, Johnson could potentially get a bigger settlement or a bigger win in trial, but also potentially could get injunctive relief again because that class has they have standing, barring if there's some decision on those arbitration agreement class action waivers.
Our guest is John Nash, and again, podcast and newsletter, Hey Not the Face. You can also follow him on Twitter at Hey Not the Face. He's done a great job of covering this for a long time in our sport. Used to write for Bloody Elbow. Guys, I know you want to weigh in on this. What do you have for John Nash?
John, so initially when the first round was done, we a lot of us felt like maybe the UFC kind of ran out the clock, as we say in other sports, right? What we don't know too much about is we know a company like that probably has excellent representation, but on the other side, on the fighter side, what do you know about their representation and how well versed are they in these types of situations?
Sorry to interrupt you, George. I can't hear goes. For some reason, it's just a lot of static on his end, on this side.
Was he talking about his commanders from Washington again? Or oh, no, I'm just kidding. Okay, so what he was saying is the representation from the fighter side, are they of well reputation? Have they done other types of cases like this and had successes, or what do you know about them?
Oh yeah, I mean there's huge firms that handle this consistently, and they do multiple cases that have won large amounts of money. I mean, that's one of the reasons when this case was filed that people that pay attention to antitrust thought the fighters had a potential chance, because these are deep pocket firms. These are not, fly by night operations. So these are guys that do this nonstop against major companies like Google and just major companies, and consistently get $100 million plus rewards. So yeah, they're not, they have some of the best plaintiff law antitrust litigants working with them.
Nolan King, what do you have for John Nash?
I think I heard John touch on it at the end of one of his answers there, but you had mentioned the arbitration waiver hearings. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, because there's 2 classes, the Lee class early from 210 to 217, and then the Johnson class. After the 2 classes were split, when they created a separate class, Johnson, the UFC introduced arbitration agreements, class action waivers. What they are is when you sign a UFC contract, you have to sign this. It says you will not take the UFC to court for any contractual problems. You will go to an arbitrator instead, and you cannot participate in a mass lawsuit or class action. You have to individually go to arbitration. So that eliminates huge numbers of fighters from the class action lawsuit right now. That's why the Johnson class was a much weaker lawsuit, because large numbers of fighters were banned from participating in the class action. So the potential damages were less. And then there's a question, can they even ask for injunctive relief? Because if all the current fighters have this class action waiver, then the class that's in the antitrust case, that class action, none of them have standing to ask for changes in the contract. So the judge, he asked them to split. He also basically demanded that the plaintiff's attorneys challenge these arbitration agreements. Now, there's no guarantee they can succeed, but they're going to have to try to go to like the Ninth Circuit and get them overturned so these fighters can participate in the class action, which would greatly increase the pool of fighters that are eligible for damages, greatly increasing the potential damages to the UFC, but also greatly increasing the potential number of fighters that could get a damage payment for this. So it's all up in the air. This will take, the Johnson class is just at the beginning phase. They just started discovery. It's going to take several years.
Dan, Tom, what do you have for John Nash?
Great explanations as far as the class separations, and I guess as far as the money or potential money, I guess we should say. Part of me, I've been kind of like listening to this podcast following the Google antitrust. I heard you mention Google, John, and I can't help but hear all these parallels, right? Where they're coming at Google talking about, well, when you have this much market share, you notice quality goes down, right? And they're talking about, both their monopolies and how they've treated it. And anybody who follows the UFC can see parallels there. So in regards to this case, though, and from a legal perspective, are there any parallels from either that case or other cases you referenced off the top of your segment here, John, that like anything you can, kind of draw from, for analysis purposes or for forecasting, any kind of trends or parallels?
Okay, Dan, I had the same problem as you before. I couldn't hear it. I'm guessing you asked that not enough people pull guard anymore, and what's my opinion on that? But I could be mistaken about that.
You didn't hear any of it?
No, for some reason, only
He said,
Weird.
Okay, he said parallels between the Google case and the UFC case, if you see any there between the two. And hopefully I got that right, Dan. If not, let me know in the chat and I can add to it.
Well, I imagine you mean the more current Google case and not the high-tech silicon worker case, which is that's the case. That case, the high-tech silicon employee case, is the one I see more comparisons to, because that was where, even though it wasn't one firm like the UFC, it was multiple companies in Silicon Valley colluding to say we are not going to hire other people's employees to keep wages low. But between this and the Google case, not in this case. I mean, you could make an argument that there's some comparisons because the UFC has bound together all these elements in the scheme, as they call it, kind of like how Google has used algorithms and YouTube and tied all these business models together, but not much besides that.
John, in the end, what do you think is the expected outcome, at least through your lenses, now that you've kind of seen in the direction it's gone, the pushback from the judge, and now the new numbers that have been thrown out? And do you think it will be good or bad for the fighters?
Well, I think the odds are we might not get a settlement with this offer, this proposal. But I guess the next step, if the judge indicates it's close, then we might get one that's a little bit higher. And then we'll have a settlement and Johnson will continue. If the judge indicates he wants something much higher, then we're definitely going to trial. So, but if there is a settlement, or if there's a trial and the fighters win, if the fighters lose, obviously it's not good for the fighters. But if the fighters win, it's maybe not, if the settlement stands, maybe it's not the massive win for the Lee fighters that a lot of people were hoping for, this huge billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar award. But it would be, I calculated based on the $375 million. Attorney fees take up a third. Basically there's a limit to how much they can take. So it'll be about a third of the winnings. So $250 million for all the fighters in the Lee class. So that would mean that if they use the same allocation as the last time, every fighter would, if you're a fighter out there, all you have to do is total up the total amount you made during the Lee class period, December 16th, 2010 to June 30th, 2017. Take your show, your win, your side letter agreements, your discretionary locker room bonuses, your fight of the nights, put all those together. 30% of that would be your total compensation. So you take 30% of that, that's your damages. Plus, for every fight you had during that period, you'd get another about $14,000. So if you fought 10 times in the UFC and made about $500,000, you would be looking at $290,000 in damages after the attorney fees. So, it's not the massive damages, I think, that some fans were holding out for and some fighters, but I know, talking to a lot of fighters, I know a lot would be happy to have something like that come their way after their fighting, long after their fighting career was done.
John, thank you so much for jumping on here with us and unpacking this. Hopefully we can have you back when there is some finality to this case, or if things proceed, because you're definitely a gift to our audience, man. That was really, really good stuff, putting it in our terms, you know.
I'm very good at dumbing it down. I got to put it at my level. So.
We're fifth graders over here. So yeah, thank you for that. All right.